Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
So the first pseudo class we'll cover here is the root pseudo class. What root does for us is select the element that is the root of the document. This will usually be the HTML element because, as we can see, it is in fact the root of our document. In our style.css file, we'll go ahead and create our root pseudo class selector by typing :root. We'll then give it a background color property and a light blue color value. So when we save our style sheet and click refresh in the browser, we see how the selector targets the HTML element as the root and turn the background color of the page light blue. Now, you might be wondering, why not just use the HTML selector instead? Well, keep in mind that the root pseudo class does have more specificity than the HTML type selector. So next up, we'll cover the target pseudo class, which allows us to target elements based on the URL. So if the element's ID matches the hash in a URL. I'll show you what I mean. In our markup, nested inside the unordered list are 3 links containing what are called fragment identifiers as their href values. The identifiers contain the hash character followed by the identifier name, which is what targets its matching ID on the page. Notice how each div has a unique ID that matches an identifier in one of the link's href values. So for example, here the S1 ID matches the S1 href value, the S2 ID matches the S2 href, and so forth. So these IDs are what the href values will target. In our style.css file, we'll create our target pseudo class selector by typing : followed by target. We'll then give it a color property and the value white, followed by a background color property and the value tomato. So when a link is clicked, if a div's ID matches one of the link's href value identifiers, the div's text color will turn white and the background color will turn tomato red. So let's take a look at this in the browser. We'll go ahead and save the style sheet and refresh the browser. And when we click on a link, we can see that fragment identifier here in the URL, which is what the browser uses to target the div with the corresponding ID. And as we can see, it takes on those target selector styles. Pretty cool. So next, if we need to target elements that have no child elements or content whatsoever, we can use the empty structural pseudo class to do just that, target empty elements. So in our style sheet, let's create a new rule using the empty pseudo class. We'll go ahead and give it a background color property, and once again, the value tomato. In our HTML file, there are currently no empty elements. As we can see, they all have child elements nested inside and content. So let's go ahead and add an empty div element to the bottom of our page. We'll go ahead and save our index file and save our style sheet, and we'll take a look at it in the browser. So when we click refresh, we see that the only element that turns red is the empty div at the bottom. Now, a good use case for this empty pseudo class selector might be for when a results field or element returns empty with no content. We can then, for example, use it to warn the user that no results were found or returned. Finally, there is a special pseudo class that's referred to as a negation pseudo class because it selects everything except the element we specify, and we can use it with just about any type of selector. So, for example, if we want to target every div that is not empty, so every div except the one here at the bottom, we can create the selector for that by typing div : not in a set of parentheses. Now, in between the parentheses is where we need to specify the type of element we do not want to target, which in our case is the empty element. So we'll go ahead and add that empty pseudo class as our argument. So when we save our style sheet and refresh the browser, we can see how all divs are selected except for the empty one here at the bottom, because we've instructed the browser not to select it by specifying it in the not pseudo class argument. We can also include an element's attribute and value in this not argument. So for example, if we want to target all divs except for the one with an ID of, say, S1, we'll need to include that in our argument. So we'll add a set of square brackets like we would for attribute selectors. Then we'll include the ID attribute followed by the value S1. So when we save our style sheet and click refresh, we can see how the browser targets the second, third, and empty div because they do not have an ID of S1. If we then change it to, say, S2, when we save and refresh, it then targets the first, last, and empty divs because, again, they either do not have an ID or they do not have an ID value of S2.